him not to fight. He made a comment that he was just upset, and then from there he considerably calmed down.
All right. Is that where you talk about in your report? He stated he was really upset, and I told him I understood, but he was not helping the situation.
Correct.
Is that a fair characterization of what happened?
Yes, sir.
Right. Then at that point, you handcuffed him.
Correct.
Right. Behind his back.
Correct.
Right. And there's a recording of all this.
That's
right.
Correct.
And it's fair to say you were giving commands along with handcuffing him, right?
You can call them commands or instruction.
Instruction. Okay, we'll call them instructions. They were direct and they were loud, right?
I believe so, yes.
It would be fair to characterize that the situation is sort of chaotic and you were handcuffing him and you were ordering him over to your car.
Yes, correct.
I mean, that's what's reflected in your report, right?
You have it in front of you.
Okay. Have you not had a chance to review it?
I've reviewed it.
Okay. All right, so you directed him over to your vehicle, and according to your report, he sat down in the rear of my patrol car with his legs hanging out the door, right?
Correct.
And at that point in time, his hands are handcuffed. Where is his phone?
His phone, I gave that to Sergeant Thorpe.
All right. But where was his phone at the time you handcuffed him?
It was in his back pocket. Once the handcuffs went on, I removed that from his person.
All right. So you took his phone after he was handcuffed?
Correct.
Did you take his wallet also?
I don't believe so.
When you directed him to your patrol car, how far away were you from the point which you handcuffed him to your car?
It wasn't far at all, like a couple steps.
A couple steps, okay. And did you just tell him, hey, go sit down in the car?
I walked him over.
Okay. Actually, hands on him. You took him over to the car and put him in the back seat.
Yep.
Okay. And you're certainly not suggesting that this was some sort of voluntary encounter, are you?
It was not.
All right, then at that point in time, I think you indicated that Mr. Harris addressed you, indicating he needed to he wanted to for you to listen to him because people needed to be called and stopped. Is that a fair characterization of what he was saying?
That's correct.
All right. And you'd already taken his phone?
I had.
And he was handcuffed?
Correct.
Okay. And he was asking you, hey, please listen to me. People need to be called and stopped?
Correct.
All right. And then you asked him, I guess a very fair question, which was, well, who needed to be called, right?
Correct.
And at that point, according to your report, he cleared his throat and told me I needed to call Little Apron Academy at Home Depot, right?
Correct.
Right. And this was in response to your question, who do we need to call?
Right.
Right. And he told you, my wife is going to pick him up there where he's not going to be. But we need to call them as soon as possible. She's going to get there and he's not going to be there. Now you put that in quotes. Is that a fair representation of what he said, or is that exactly what he said?
That's exactly what he said. That's
Okay.
why it's in quotes.
Did you make that call for him?
I did not.
Did you ask him if his wife's phone number was in the phone that somebody else could call?
I did not.
All right. But you did question him at that point, right?
I asked him questions, correct?
Right. So it's fair to say also you began questioning him, but you did not read him Miranda.
I didn't need to.
Okay. The question I'm asking is, you didn't read him Miranda.
Correct.
And your testimony is, your belief is that you didn't need to, right?
I did not.
That's your belief?
That is my belief.
Okay. So you didn't think there was any problem with you questioning him there while he was handcuffed against his will in the back of a police car?
That's correct, and that's based on my training and experience.
Okay. And training experience, like in at that time you were not yet a detective. Had you had any particular training in the difference between a Fourth Amendment scenario and a Miranda scenario?
We do. Training in Cobb County is very extensive. It's one of the longest academies in the state. And we do go over Fourth Amendment versus a detention.
Okay. So you thought it was okay to question him because he's not formally arrested?
That's correct.
All right. And in your mind, until you told him, or somebody told him, hey, you're formally under arrest and these are your charges, he's just detained and you can continue to ask him questions?
That's correct.
All right. And so that's what you did. And you asked him why his wife would think their son was at daycare, correct?
Correct.
All right. And he responded to you, and he told you, I was supposed to drop him off this morning and I didn't do a second look in my car. Those were his words?
Those were his words.
All right. You then said, I then retrieved Mr. Harris's information and learned from him that the child's name was Cooper. All right, how did you retrieve that information?
I asked him.
Okay. And is this when you testified on direct then, you were basically getting some basic information like name, date of birth, address, son's name, that sort of information?
Correct. Administrative questions.
Administrative questions, okay. All right, you then begin questioning him a little more detailed beyond just the administrative stuff. You started asking him questions about, well, how long has he been in the car, right?
Correct.
And I know that the video is kind of hard to hear, some of that. Did you have a chance to go over that? Did you have a chance to look at the video and review that?
I have reviewed it.
Okay. Were you able to determine the exact questions you were asking him after reviewing the video?
If I reviewed it, I probably could write it out for you.
Okay. It's kind of hard to understand.
It is. I understand that.
So, so all we've got to go on is your report and your memory. So to the best of your recollection, other than asking him these questions that we've gone over and asking him, hey, how long has he been in the car? What else did you ask him?
Actually, so I can go back. I never asked him how long Cooper had been in the car. I
Okay.
asked him what time he was supposed to drop him off at Home Depot. I believe that was the question. I could be mistaken.
All right. Well, to the best of your recollection, what specifically did you question him about?
What time he was supposed to drop his son off.
Okay. And you've indicated that you've had some very specific police training,
Yes,
right?
sir.
And you testified a few moments ago that you, upon getting there, you observed another officer giving compression, right?
Correct.
And you testified that You observed signs consistent with rigor mortis, right?
Correct.
Which means that you knew at that point the child was already dead.
Correct.
Okay. So what was your purpose of asking what time he was supposed to drop him off?
Determine, first of all, yes, I saw marbling. I couldn't tell you how quickly after death that can happen. It could be, to my knowledge, it could be a few minutes. I don't know. And part of it is, for any officer, when you go to a scene where a child has died, you hold on to any bit of hope that you can do something for him. So asking that question was really is there something that we could have done?
Right.
Could we transport? Is there still hope? Can there be more?
Your testimony in direct was that you asked that question for medical purposes, for the first responders to give them information, but in fact you knew the child was already dead. There wasn't any medical information that could be gleaned and assist the child with your questioning about what time was he supposed to drop him off, was there?
Well, he could have dropped him off supposedly an hour ago. I didn't know. That's why I asked that question. If it had been recent, was there more we could do? I knew at that point where Officer Gallimore and Officer Folia were doing compressions, there's nothing I could do to assist them.
Is it your testimony then that you believe that you could retrieve some medical information about what time he was supposed to drop him off that would have assisted the medical personnel in bringing the child back from the dead?
My testimony is that it's a question that medical responders would need to know. Not that we could bring them back, even though I'm sure everyone, well, almost everyone in this courtroom would want to do that.
And during the time these conversations are occurring, you acknowledge that Mr. Harris is in the back of a police car against his will, and he's handcuffed. And you have seized his personal property, right?
We have him detained, correct.
What else did you ask him about?
From the point that I moved the car forward, I didn't ask him anything else until I asked him what type of law enforcement experience he had at the headquarters.
Okay. You asked him no more questions at all?
No, he asked me, well, he made statements to me about when he was in the car. I didn't ask him anything else once I moved the car forward. I know he continued to make statements to me.
You testified that you saw EMT Barwick address, or actually you overheard EMT Barwick address Mr. Harris while Mr. Harris was in the police car?
That's correct.
And were you sitting in the car while that conversation took place?
I was not.
How far away from the car were you?
I was standing in the door.
And did you see anyone else come up to the car or overhear anyone else come up to the car and question Mr. Harris?
I did not.
Did you ever become aware if anybody else came up to the car and questioned Mr. Harris?
I did not.
Your testimony is that Detective Stoddard, however, spoke to Mr. Harris through the car window when you were pulling off?
Correct.
All right. Is that the only time that, and at that time, Detective Stoddard, he was in fact a detective then, right?
He was.
All right. Are you aware of any other detective that came up and spoke to him?
Not to my knowledge.
That being spoke to Mr. Harris?
Correct. Not to my knowledge. I was doing other things at the scene. I was talking to DFACs. I was also securing the perimeter.
Okay. And in fact, you did not return Mr. Harris's phone,
I did not.
and you did not release him from his handcuffs as he requested,
I did not.
and you did not release him from your patrol car.
Correct.
You drove him to headquarters where you turned him over to someone else, right?
That's correct.
You mentioned both in direct and cross that Mr. Harris spoke to you from the back of the car,
Correct.
and it's true that on the video we can't hear what he said, right?
You might be able to.
Okay. And your response to him, whatever he said to you, your response to him was, I understand your need to want to speak with me, but that you couldn't.
Correct.
Okay. And during the entire time that we've discussed here, from your first encounter until you turned him over to Detective, is it Adamczyk?
That's correct.
Is that how you pronounce it?
You got it right.
After all these years, I should know it by now.
I understand.
You didn't hear anybody Mirandizing.
No,
You didn't do it.
I did not.
Judge, I think for right now, I think that's all the questions that I've got. Thank you.
Yes, Judge, 3 brief topics. Detective Piper, the defense counsel on cross-examination asked you about your questioning of Mr. Harris.
Correct.
In the entirety, was that basically 2 questions you asked in those few minutes span?
Yes, sir.
Okay. When you asked the question, why do you need to call your wife, or why is she the person you need to call, was that in response to the defendant's request to make phone calls?
It was.
The other question that you asked about how long the child had been, or basically what time he was supposed to drop the child off, was that made actually before the EMT was able to speak with him?
Correct.
Okay, and did the EMT, in fact, for medical purposes, ask those questions, even though y'all all thought the child was deceased?
He did.
I think that's all I have, Judge.
And that EMT's not a police officer, right?
He is not.
And as far as you know, that EMT doesn't have this police training that you have to understand the difference between Fourth Amendment analysis and Miranda analysis, right?
To my knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you.
They would call Detective Stoddard.
I do.
Detective, would you please introduce yourself to the court by telling her your name and spelling it so the court reporter gets it correct?
Yeah, it's Detective Phil Phil Stoddard, Stoddard.
And Detective Stoddard, where do you work?
I work for the Cobb County Police Department. I'm currently assigned to the Crimes Against Persons Division.
Okay, how long have you been in law enforcement?
13 years.
And where did you start off in law enforcement?
Started off law enforcement in the city of Atlanta.
Okay, how long did you work there?
6 years.
And
Up to 2007, then I came over to Cobb County. I've worked for Cobb County since 2007.
And with Cobb County, have you always worked in crimes against persons?
I have not.
Okay, where did you work prior? Well, how long have you been in crimes against persons, just generally?
2 years. Cool, coming up on 2 years in December.
Okay, and before that, what department did you work with, or what unit or division did you work
Before
with?
that, I worked for the Crimes Against Children's Division. And before that, I was a field training officer and work patrol down in Precinct 2.
Okay, you post-certified?
I am post-certified.
Were you post-certified back on the 18th of June, 2014?
I was.
Okay. And back on June 18th, 2014, what unit were you working with?
With Crimes Against Persons.
Okay. And as a part of your training for persons and child crimes and as a road officer, did you have training in the field of investigating and interviewing people suspected of crimes?
I did.
I'm going to turn your attention to this case involving the defendant. Do you recognize Justin Ross Harris in the court today?
I do. Justin Ross Harris is sitting to my left at the defendant's table wearing a red jumpsuit.
Your Honor, ask the record reflect the detectives identified the defendant. Detective Stoddard, when did you first encounter and first speak with Mr. Harris?
I met Mr. Harris. It was at the Acres Mill location or the incident location. We arrived on scene. I was told that they had a person in custody or being detained. That's what they said in the back of the police car. He had failed to follow their orders. I took a walk down over to the police car just to get a look at who we were dealing with, and I saw Justin Ross Harris in the back of the police car.
And when is the first time you actually spoke any words to him, or he spoke any words to you?
It was right around that time. Once I got on scene, I don't remember how long we were there before I spoke to him, but it's sometime on scene. I went down there just to see who was in the police car.
Okay. And what type of questioning or what at all was said?
All I did was I just introduced myself, told him Detective Phil Stoddard, who I worked for, the Cobb County Police Department, and my position was I was a detective. He was very concerned that he was being detained, and I said, we'll speak when we get back up to headquarters.
And at this point, was this well after all of the conversations with Officer Piper and the defendant right at the scene when all this had first occurred?
Yes, sir.
Did you speak with him again at any point before encountering him at the police department?
I did not.
Now, when you saw the defendant at the police department, tell the judge, first of all, where was it at the Cobb County Police Department that you met with the defendant?
It was at headquarters. It's 140 North Marietta Street in the Crimes Against Persons office. In the office we have 2 interview rooms. They're side by side actually inside the office. They're a carpeted room, have a couple of chairs. There are visible cameras in the room. He was placed inside the room. There was, at the time, there was not locks on the door, so he was placed inside the room, unhandcuffed and given water.
Did you, during that time, was he held without like food or drink, or was he refused opportunities to go to the bathroom or anything of that nature before you spoke with him?
No, not at all. Detective Adamczyk's the one that put him in the room. He was, like I said, Judge, he was unhandcuffed. He was given water. He was offered snacks. We offered him coffee. He was allowed to go to use the restroom before the interview began.
And when you actually first went in and spoke with him, did he appear coherent?
He did.
Did he appear to be under the influence of any alcohol, drugs, or anything of that nature?
No.
And describe the room to the judge. What type of room is this that you were having this interview in?
It's a small, it's like a little small office. There's a 2-way mirror behind, and I believe at the time we still had it covered, but it was there, and people know what it is. There's a whiteboard up on the opposite wall, painted just very neutral colors, on the table, and I believe 3 chairs.
And who was in the interview with you and the defendant?
Detective Pete Waldorf.
Now, at this time, was he under formal arrest or anything of that nature? Had you decided to take out a warrant yet or anything?
No.
Okay. At that point, though, in speaking with the defendant, did you decide to inform him of any rights?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what rights did you inform him of?
I informed him of the Miranda rights.
And does the Cobb County Police Department, and do you have any forms that you utilize in informing defendants of their, or suspects of their rights?
Yes, we do. We have a standard Miranda form that we use.
Okay. Show defense counsel what a marking for identification purposes of State's Exhibit 1. Detective, showing you what a mark for identification purposes of State's Exhibit 1. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 1?
I do.
How do you recognize that?
This was the manila envelope that I put the Miranda form in. Was signed, sealed with red tape, and has my initials and a date. It would have been the 6th of January 2015 across it.
And have you looked at what's in the envelope?
Yes, I have. It is the standard Miranda form that we use at the Cobb County Police Department, and it is the Miranda form that I used that day to advise Justin Ross Harris of his rights.
And is that in the same condition as the day that you actually went over his rights and had him sign off on them?
Yeah, it was 3-hole punch to be put in a binder, and that would be the only thing different.
Your Honor, I tender State's Exhibit 1 for the purposes of this hearing.
No objection.
And Your Honor, asking the defendant just to read into the record what rights he went over with the defendant at this time.
At the beginning, of course, it has a case number at the top. He was asked for his level of education. He said he had gone to Alabama. Asked him what he does. He was doing something with computers, intoxication. Asked him about intoxication. He said none. In English, he said yes, it's his primary language. Then it comes down and says the place where it came from was the Cobb County where we were. It says place, Cobb County headquarters or Cobb headquarters. The date was 6/18/2014 and the time is 18:20. When I read these, we read it line by line. Before we ask you any question, you must understand your rights. You have the right to remain silent. And then I'll look over to him and make sure he understood that, and then I'll check it, and anything you say can be used against you in court. You understand? Yes. Check. You have the right to talk to a lawyer for advice. Before you ask you any questions and to have him or her with you during questioning, do you understand? Yes. Check. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you before any questioning if you wish. Do you understand? Check. If you decide to answer questions now without a lawyer present, you still have the right to stop answering at any time. You also have the right to stop answering at any time until you talk to the lawyer. Check. Then I asked, what does this mean to you? And then at that time, Justice Ross Harris stated that he understood his rights, so that meant that he did not have to talk to me without a lawyer present. And once again, I'll paraphrase. I'm not going to say exactly what he said. I don't have it in front of me, Judge. And then, of course, then we go through the waiver of the rights. I have read this statement of my rights, and I understand what my rights are. I am willing to make a statement and answer questions. I do not want a lawyer at this time. I understand and know what I am doing. No promises or threats have been made to me. No pressure or coercion of any kind has been used against me. Then it is signed by Ross Harris, it's signed by myself, and also witnessed by Detective Pete Waldorf.
Detective Stoddard, did he agree to speak with you, and did he in fact speak with you after that point?
Yes, he did.
Okay. Did he appear to you to freely and voluntarily waive his rights and agree to speak with you freely and voluntarily?
Yes, sir.
At any time during the interview of the defendant or before that, did you hold out any hope of benefit or promise him anything to get him to speak with you?
No.
Did you ever threaten him in any way, threaten him with injury or any type of bad consequences to get him to make a statement?
I did not.
Okay. And further, was this Mirandizing the defendant actually recorded?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And the rest of his statement, was it actually recorded as well?
It was.
Now, about how long was the total interview from the time you walked into Mirandize until, at some point did he request to end the interview?
Yes, he did.
Okay. From the point where you came in and started talking to him until the end of that interview, about how long was it?
There's actually like 44 minutes worth of interview, I believe.
Okay. And is there about a 28-minute break where there's no interview going on?
That is correct.
I'm going to show defense counsel what a mark for identification purposes as being the State's Exhibit 2. Detective, I'm going to show you what's been marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibit 2. Do you recognize that?
I did.
And how do you recognize it?
It's a DVD-R that I created from the original copy of the interview. The interview was recorded onto a system. It's called Video Oversight. It's a secured system. From that secured system, I made a DVD-R, and from that DVD-R, I copied it onto this DVD-R.
And have you reviewed that video?
I have reviewed this video.
And is it a fair and accurate representation of the interview of Mr. Harris, specifically regarding you informing him of his Miranda rights and him waiving them?
Yes.
Okay, Your Honor, I would tender State's Exhibit 2 at this time.
Any objection? Admitted.
Your Honor, for the purposes of this hearing, I'd ask for permission to publish the part of this interview where the detective goes over his Miranda rights.
What's that?
Thank you. Your Honor, for the record, I'm starting this video at 6:17 and 13, 6:17:13 p.m.
Do you need any more water? Do you want some coffee or anything? Okay. Before we sit and talk, and I know you've been searched before, but since we're going to sit here and talk a little bit, you just go ahead and stand up. And all I need to do is I'm just going to check. And my arm is supposed to be on this. You don't need to stand up here. If you want to turn to stay full, it's easier to put your hands around your head. Okay. I think it's more comfortable for you. I'll have both iPhone cable and the other one. Oh, that's perfectly okay. I'm looking for anything that's a little bit bigger than I think. Understandable. This is me one off. I was here too, and then I worked for Tuscaloosa Police for 5 years. Did you know? I wasn't a police officer. What did you do? I was dispatched. But my brother was our sergeant. What do you do for Home Depot? Web developer. I quit the police department to go back to school. A web developer? How'd that go? It's great. I like the job. Are you with your class? I am. And the lady chocolate is selling Bridge Church and so. Okay, yeah. Okay, what's your name? I'm sorry. Everything, man.
And then you gotta check him for,
Well, being a jailer, is it just in house Harris?
just an officer.
Do you prefer just by rules? Right. My name's Phil Stoddard. I am a detective with County Police Department.
Absolutely.
We're at my headquarters.
When you know this place.
This is my apartment flight.
Let's see if I've driven by it many times.
Okay. It's my apartment, detective people. And first, you know why we're here. Okay. Before we begin, I gotta ask you some, just some basic questions, okay? What's your level of education?
College degree.
All right, what's your degree?
Management information systems.
Where'd you get it from?
Alabama.
Okay. Are you under the influence of any intoxicants right now? Alcohol, prescription medications? Do you take any prescription medications? Do you have any medical conditions that require a doctor's care on a regular basis?
No.
Okay. Anything illegal?
No.
Or have the drug police?
No.
Okay. And English is your primary language?
Is it?
Okay.
If not, I'm never good.
You're doing great. You'd be surprised. We did interview some French people, and their English was 100 times better than mine. Okay. We are at police headquarters. Before we begin, you don't need any water?
No.
You just went and used the bathroom?
I did.
So you use the 18. And I just want to hear, what happened, during your day. Okay? Before we do that, you've watched TV, you were in jail before. Okay? I'm going to read you your rights. And that protects you, protects me.
Absolutely.
Okay? Before we ask so many questions, you must understand your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Understand? Anything you say can be used against you in court.
Absolutely.
Okay? You have the right to talk to a lawyer for advice before we ask you any questions, and to have him or her with you during the questioning. Do you understand that? You come to a lawyer. One will be appointed for any questioning if you wish. Do you understand that? Okay. If you decide to answer questions now about a lawyer present, you still have the right to stop answering any time. You also have the right to stop answering any time until you talk to a lawyer. Do you understand that?
I do.
Okay. What does that mean to you?
I mean, it's clear cut. I've heard it a million times.
Basically,
I can invoke my right to silence at any given time.
you can answer one question, skip two questions, answer one more question.
At any time, I can say, I'll run that for you.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
This is your waiver of rights. Can you read that out loud for me?
I've read the statement of my rights and I understand what my rights are. I'm willing to make a statement and answer questions. I do not want a lawyer at this time. I understand and know what I am doing. No promises or threats have been made to me and no pressure or coercion of any kind has been used against me.
Let's just start with basics. Where do you live?
I live in Marietta, Georgia.
Okay, what's your address?
1212.
Your Honor, I'm stopping it at 62225 for the record. Detective, after you spoke with the defendant, and at a time after he had said that he didn't want to speak anymore, did you make the decision and did you go in and inform him that you would be arresting him for the charges of felony murder based on cruelty to children?
I did.
Okay. And who went with you? Well, first of all, what room did that take place in?
It took place in the same interview room
Mhm.
that our initial interview had taken place in, and Detective Racy, David Racy, was with me.
Okay. When you went in that interview room, had the defendant already been informed that he was going to be arrested before you informed him of what charges he was going to be arrested for now?
Yes.
Okay. When you brought him back into that interview room, what were you going to do in addition to informing him of what he was going to be charged with?
We're going to photograph Ross Harris, what clothing he's wearing, his outward appearance, and then I was going to inform him of what charges that I was going to seek through the magistrate court.
And when you walk, is that standard course, photographing people and things like that?
Yes, it is.
And what were you guys going to utilize to actually photograph?
We just used the camera, a little digital camera.
Now, at some point, when you went into that room and you actually told him you were charging him with felony murder and cruelty, at that point, had you mentioned anything about the word malice?
I don't believe so.
At this point, when you went in to speak with him, was there anything that caught y'all's attention that caused you to start recording it on the camera?
Yeah, Detective Racy was standing in the corner. I had actually sat down to explain to Ross his charges and told him it was going to be the cruelty to a child and the felony murder. And at that time, he looked at me and goes, there was no malicious intent. David Racy then turned his camera back on and started filming it.
Now, when you say you informed him of this charge, at this point, is that common that you inform people of what they're being charged with?
Yes.
Did you at any point ask him any questions or anything like that?
I did not.
Okay. When he said that, did he ask you questions about elements of charges and things like that?
He did.
Okay. Did you answer his questions as best you could?
As best I could. I asked him to, to actually sit down and look it up, get the complete answer.
And did you, now this video, it was taken, you said on a camera?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the whole conversation is recorded?
It is. Well, not the first part.
Right.
Just when he starts.
And that was based on his comment that y'all turned the camera on?
That is correct.
So after, during the context of this, does he keep making statements about the charges?
He does.
Were any of those statements in response to questions that you asked in any way?
No.
And with those questions, did you threaten him in any way, promise him anything to get him to make those statements?
No.
Just have a second, Your Honor. And Detective, just a couple of things, and I don't remember if we covered it on the video or on the form. How old was the defendant at the time?
32.
Okay. And had he ever, on any prior time before you walked into that courtroom, did he prior to that refuse to talk to you or invoke any rights or anything like that?
No.
That's all I have.
Detective Stoddard, when you got to the scene, did you arrive alone or were you with another detective?
I was with another detective.
Who were you with?
Sean Murphy.
Right. Is that who was in the interview room with you?
It was not.
Who was in the interview room?
Detective Pete Waldorf.
Pete Waldorf?
Yes, sir.
So you and Sean Murphy arrived at the scene together in the same car.
That's correct.
And when you arrived, EMTs were already there.
Yes.
Mr. Harris was already in a police car.
Yes, sir.
And you agree with the prior testimony. I mean, he was handcuffed.
Yes, sir.
Did you, how long were you at the scene before you spoke to Mr. Harris?
I don't recall exactly how much time I was there.
Okay. Well, if you were going to estimate, would it be more than 10 minutes?
Yes.
And so during that, well, let me ask you, would it have been more than 20 minutes?
I don't know.
Possibly.
I say between 10 and 20 would be good. We weren't on scene for that long.
And in that time between your arrival and when you spoke with Mr. Harris, did you obtain information from any of the other officers?
Yes.
Did you talk to anybody who had already spoken to Mr. Harris?
I talked to Detective Piper.
Okay. Detective Piper,
Yes.
were you aware if anybody else spoke to him?
No.
Did you authorize anybody else to speak to him?
No.
Were there any, to the best of your knowledge, were there any individuals on the scene that had a badge and gun on their hip who were not police officers?
I know there was a security guard. I don't know if he was armed or not, but not to my knowledge.
Did you see a security guard go up and speak to Mr. Harris?
No.
Before you went up and spoke to him, you learned in fact that the child was deceased.
That is correct.
And if I understand your testimony correctly, you went up to the car and introduced yourself.
That is correct.
Told him you work for Cobb County Police, correct?
Correct.
And he expressed concern, is what you said.
Yes.
Right. And I don't believe in your report you indicate what that means or anything, but what did he tell you? Hey, I'm worried. What's going on?
Well, why am I still in the back of the police car in handcuffs?
Okay. What'd you tell him?
I told him that we were going to talk when we get up to headquarters.
All right. So basically, an introduction, who you are, where you work. He says, well, I'm in the back of a police car still. You said, we'll talk at headquarters. So that whole conversation could have only taken, what, 15 seconds?
It was pretty brief.
And was that conversation right before, now Detective Piper, before her cruiser left the scene?
I believe so. Or a short time before.
All right. And your testimony is that is the only conversation that you had with Mr. Harris before he left the scene?
I don't recall any other conversation with Mr. Harris.
Okay. Is that, are you answering in the affirmative then? That is the only conversation you had with him?
I am answering that.
I'm going to project to believe that was responsive and give the best answers he could.
He has him on cross.
You either spoke to him before or you didn't.
Well, Mr. Kilgore, I don't recall speaking to him. I recall speaking to him once. Okay. Is it possible you forgot?
Of course.
Okay. Sometimes we forget things, right?
Yes, sir, we do.
Next time you spoke to him, you were at the police headquarters. I want to know, how long was he there at headquarters before you started talking to him?
The video starts at 1800 hours. That's probably around the time he got there. 1814, he does a restroom break with Detective Adam Check. I start my interview at 1817 hours. So from the video, we can say about 17 minutes.
All right, and that's time, to the best of your recollection, and reviewing the materials, from the time Adam Check brought him in to your introduction, about 17 minutes.
Yeah, from the time the video starts. So it's probably around the time Adam Check put him in the room.
Right. Do you know how long he was in the room from the time Adam Check came in until the video started?
No.
Do you know if anybody else spoke to him during that period of time?
I do not.
All right, when you first came in, you introduced yourself?
I did.
Right. Your testimony was that you had already had that introduction, you'd already had that conversation at the scene, right?
Correct.
Did you forget that you had had that conversation an hour earlier?
I did not.
You just thought you need to introduce yourself again?
No, well, it's polite. He's in the interview room. He's unhandcuffed. He's been through an experience. We're starting over. We're getting everything on tape and explaining who I am and starting from scratch.
And is it fair to say that certainly at that juncture, when you are having polite conversation and then you begin reading him Miranda rights and going through them with him, he was certainly likewise pleasant and cordial and cooperative. Is that fair to say?
I would say that's fair to say.
At some point in time, oh goodness, this interview, did you leave the room a couple of times during the interview?
I believe you left once.
All right. I mean, it's a fairly lengthy interview. I mean, this isn't just a few minutes. Is it, what, maybe close to an hour or so?
46 minutes approximately.
46 minutes, okay. And then you certainly agree that at some point in time, you very specifically tell him he is going to be charged.
Yes.
And in fact, you told him exactly what he was going to be charged with.
At that time, yes.
You told him he was going to be charged with cruelty to a child.
That is correct.
And then after some more discussion about that, you don't deny that there was a specific invocation of rights made by Mr. Harris.
Correct.
All right. And based on that, you stopped talking to him.
I stopped asking any questions.
Stopped
Yes.
asking him questions.
Yes, sir.
He then testified that after that, you went back in and there was some additional communication.
Correct.
How much of a gap in time occurred between when you terminated the interview and when you went back in and there was additional conversation?
I would say over an hour.
Who went back in with you?
Detective David Racy.
Was it in the same interview room that we just saw the video of?
Yes, sir.
So that room certainly has video capabilities.
It does.
Right. But you did not turn on the video when you and Detective Racing went back in there.
I did not.
And your testimony is you went back in there to tell him you were going to photograph him?
Yep, just a photograph.
That was it?
Mm-hmm.
Just photograph him?
Photograph him, advise him the specific charges I was going to seek from the magistrate court.
Okay. And you agree at that point in time when you went back in there to advise him about he had invoked
Yes.
and you had told him charges that you were going to take?
And I told him cruelty and child, yes.
To the best of your recollection, what was the first thing you advised him of when you went back into that room?
That he was going to get charged with cruelty to child and felony murder.
And from that first moment, your testimony is this conversation's not recorded.
Yes,
From the moment you walked in there and started talking to him, you were not recording the conversation.
that is correct.
How long were you in there talking to him before you or Racy started recording the conversation?
Not long.
Okay. Not long is, I mean, that's different to different people. Could you give me some idea of what, in time-wise, how long you were in there?
How long it took me to say, is you're going to be your charges today? And then to advise him that it's going to be cruelty to child and felony murder. And that's when he said, there's no malicious intent. Both Detective Racy and I paused. He started his video up on his camera, and the rest of it is recorded.
Okay. So the two of you paused. Did you look at each other, or did you signal each other, or anything like that?
No, there was no signal.
There's no signal? Didn't have to be? Is that because you or Racy one were ready to start recording when you walked in there?
No. Just because it was an unusual statement.
Okay. Well, what I'm asking is, did you, you said you only told him one thing. You're going to be charged with felony murder and cruelty, and then all of a sudden now y'all are recording.
Yes.
Okay. Did you go in there with one of your phones ready to record?
No.
Who recorded? You or Racy?
Detective David Racy.
You know what kind of phone it was?
It wasn't on a phone.
What was it on?
It was on a camera.
And you certainly agree that from the time that Detective Racy started recording again, there had been no recanting of Mr. Harris's assertion of his rights.
I would agree to that.
Did he specifically tell you that, you know what, I've decided I don't want a lawyer?
No.
He did not?
No.
So if I understand the sequence then, after about a 45-minute, 46-minute, whatever interview, you tell him he's going to be charged with cruelty. He then says, well, if that's the case, I'm going to stop talking, I'm not saying anything else, and I want a lawyer, right?
That is correct.
Then an hour later, you go back in and record him with Detective Racy.
Well, you're skipping he was brought back into the room to be photographed. When we're getting ready to photograph him, I'm like, Ross, this is what you are going to be charged with, because I believe you have a right to know what charges I'm going to go in front and ask for from the magistrate. So he was told it's going to be cruelty to a child and it's going to be felony murder.
Okay.
He made the comment that there was no malicious intent.
Okay.
Then it was an unusual statement to us. It's not something I had heard from a defendant before. We decided to start recording, or actually Detective Racy decided to start recording on his camera.
During that gap in time, did you become aware that Mr. Harris said, I've changed my mind, I don't want a lawyer?
Mr. Core, it's been answered. I said no.
So other than telling him that he was going to be photographed, you thought it was necessary to, again, apprise him of the charges?
Apprise him of both the charges, yes.
Is your testimony that you and Detective Racy did not discuss this in advance of walking back in that room?
Yes.
You didn't talk amongst each other about, let's have something ready to record this in case he says something else?
No, there's no conspiracy to record your client.
Those aren't my words. I'm just asking whether or not y'all talked about it.
I got a little different take on that. You got together, you said we're going to go in there and photograph them. Detective Racy made a decision to start videoing. There was at no time did we discuss videotaping your client.
Did you direct Sean Murphy to speak with Mr. Harris?
I did not.
Did you observe Sean Murphy speak with Mr. Harris?
I did not.
Did Sean Murphy advise you if he spoke with Mr. Harris?
I don't recall.
You're the case agent. Have you reviewed the file? And do you have any knowledge if Sean Murphy spoke with Mr. Harris?
I don't have any direct knowledge that Sean Murphy spoke with Ross Harris at the scene.
If I understand if I understand the sequence of events, then just to be clear, time-wise, is it your testimony that only a few seconds elapsed in the room when you went back in there before Detective Racy turned his recorder on?
Yeah, it wasn't long at all.
Less than 20 seconds.
I'm not going to estimate. It was not that long.
Less than a minute.
Once again, I've answered. No, I'm not going to answer. It was long enough for me to advise him of his 2 charges that the video started. After he said there was no malicious intent.
Judge, if I could just have one moment, I think I'm real close to finishing up. How long did it take to photograph Mr. Harris?
A few minutes.
A few minutes being 2, a few minutes being 6?
I'm not sure.
Would it be fair to say it was maybe 4 or 5 minutes?
I don't know how long it was. It was just a few minutes.
Okay. Obviously, Detective, none of us are police officers and none of us were there, and I'm assuming that this particular part was not recorded, the photographing?
I don't believe so.
Is it your testimony that you went into the room and advised Mr. Harris of his charges before you started photographing him?
I don't recall if it was before or after.
Okay. Well, then, let's go back to what we've been talking about then, because I want to be real clear.
Okay.
What I've asked you about is after this hour gap,
Mm-hmm.
and you went back into the interview room with Detective Racy.
Yes, sir.
It was my understanding from your testimony
Mm-hmm.
that you were only in there a few seconds and asked him one question or advised him of one thing, that you were going to charge him with felony murder and cruelty, and then he started talking.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So is it accurate then to say you hadn't photographed him yet?
I'm not sure, sir. I don't know whether David Racy or Detective Racy photographed him before I came in, or we came in right at that same time. I remember that when I came in, I just advised him, I had my water thing that was for my coffee pot with me. It's that little water thing you see. And I had just come in real quick. This is what I'm going to advise you of, and then I left.
I'm on direct. Was your testimony not that you came back into the room for a second time for the purpose specifically of photographing him and advising him of his charges?
That is correct.
Then you testified that you came into the room and within just seconds, you advised him of what his charges were. He started talking, y'all started recording.
That's correct.
So you had not photographed him yet.
I don't recall, sir.
Well, if we came into the room and we started photographing him and 4 or 5 minutes went by, and then I started advising him of charges, that's a completely different scenario than what you've just testified to, isn't that correct?
Mr. Biltmore, if we can ask, that's something we can ask Detective Racy too, when he actually took the photos. Was the photos taken before I walked in that room? Were they taken after? I don't recall right now. I remember when I walked in that room, I had my coffee thing with me filled with water. I asked him a few questions. I didn't ask any questions. I asked him, told him, advised him of what the charges were going to be, and then we moved on.
Right. So you want to, do you want to retract your testimony from direct then? That you
No,
walked
I'm
into
not
that
going to
room
retract. I think I made it perfectly clear. When I walked in that room, this is what I asked him, or what I told him. It was just a few minutes or a few seconds. I was not in the room for that long. I had my coffee thing with me. I don't know if David or Detective Racy had already photographed him or whether he was photographed afterwards. I'm sorry, I don't recall that. I know my interaction with your client was brief.
Okay. So is it your testimony then that you and Detective Racy did not walk in that room together as you previously testified?
I don't recall. I thought we did. It's a possibility that I'm wrong.
Maybe you forgot.
It's a possibility that I'm wrong.
Well, if you're wrong about that, then is it possible you're wrong about what your testimony was on direct, is that you walked into that room for the purpose of doing two things, photographing him and advising him of his charges?
No.
So it could be that, or it could be that Detective Racy had already photographed him and you walked in there with your coffee and got into the middle of the conversation.
No, there was no conversation when I walked in.
What was going on when you walked in?
Objection asked and answered about 37 times, Judge.
Would it assist you perhaps if I refreshed your recollection with one of the reports regarding this incident?
Sure.
I'm showing Racy's report.
Okay.
Page 69.
Thank you.
That's it.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Right. What I've shown you is Racy's report about what happened, which you've been testifying to. Does that refresh your recollection a little bit as to what actually happened?
Yes, sir.
All right. So is it fair to say that in contrast to what your testimony was on direct, what actually occurred was that after photographing Mr. Harris, y'all sat him down in the interview room and started advising him of his charges?
And that's not what it says. It says after he's photographed, I came in, or after he was photographed, I advised him of what charges he was going to be taken out.
Okay. If you would just read out loud, beginning with the word after.
After photographing the suspect, Detective Stoddard had Justin sit down in the interview room and was advising him of his charges.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you again.
Mhm.
How long did it take you to photograph him?
I don't recall photographing him.
Was there any communication or discussion or conversation while you were photographing him?
I don't recall photographing him.
Okay. Is your testimony then that you were not present and Detective Racy photographed him?
Answered, I don't recall. I don't remember.
Okay. But you certainly agree with what the report says, which is after he was photographed, in contrast to what you said on direct, you put him in an interview room and started talking to him about his charges or telling him what his charges were.
No. He was in the interview room to be photographed. According to Detective Racy's report, after he was photographed, he was sat down and then I advised him of his charges.
All right. And were you seated and Detective Racy seated also?
I was seated. Detective Racy was not.
Okay. Where was Detective Racy?
I believe he was standing.
And it's during this point in time, after the photographing, that your testimony is that he started talking to you again after you advised him of what he was charged with.
That's correct.
Right. Good. And we agree, or rather you agree, that there had been nothing in the hour-long gap where he had come back and said, hey, I've changed my mind. I decided I don't need a lawyer.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. And in this hour gap, Detective, had you actually been interviewing other witnesses and then speaking with supervisors about this before you took out these other charges?
I had.
Okay. Now, defense counsel asked you about whether you and Detective Racy had talked about and discussed going in and recording the defendant.
That's correct.
What would have been easier, to actually hit the record button to record in the interview room, or to take a camera with recording capability in?
It would have been a lot easier just to turn on the video oversight again and then sit down and video.
Okay.
record.
If you were to trick somebody that you weren't recording, that would have been easier to do that surreptitiously by going and hitting the button to record it, the interview room, or by trying to turn on a camera to record.
Hitting the button, turn on record.
And he asked you questions about whether you recorded the taking of the photographs. Can you actually record video and take photographs from the same camera?
Not to my knowledge.
All right. Now, I believe you stated the interview you did of the defendant was around, it started around 6:20 from the video we saw, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so that was less than 2 hours from the time the defendant had actually pulled in to that parking lot at Mattio's, correct?
That is correct.
And you stated finally that you talked about your conversation with the defendant at the scene and that he was complaining. I believe you stated it was about he was wondering why he was still detained.
Correct.
Okay. Based on that, did it appear to you that he thought this detention was going to be temporary?
It's not relevant. That's not relevant to a Miranda analysis, Judge. Just not. So I'm going to object to that question.
Oh,
And I'll state the same response I've had previously, Judge, that it is. Okay. Thank you. So did it appear that he thought that detention at the scene was going to be temporary?
Calls for speculation.
Based on what he said to you?
Yes.
Still calls for speculation.
I believe he's answered it, Judge. That's all I have.
I don't have any follow-up questions, Judge.
you can step in.
The state has no further witnesses or evidence, Judge.
Does the defense have evidence or are we ready for argument?
No, ma'am. Can we ask for a few moments break? Okay, thank you.
I'll try for 5 minutes, I'll tell you, it's now 5 minutes. We'll wait till 11:30, be ready to argue at that time.
Thank you, Your Honor.